Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation to come and speak to you all today. I've been given the very small task, easy task, of summarizing what's been happening in the world of peace operations in Africa for the last 20 years or so. Tom didn't make me go back to the 1950s at least, but we've got a huge canvas on which to talk. And as you know, probably better than me, just in the 21st century, we've seen over 50 different peace operations deployed on the African continent. So I'm not going to try and summarize all these different types of missions. But instead, I wanted to try and do three main things in my time and then open it up to some questions and discussion. Firstly, just provide a bit of what I think are the important context for these missions and look a little bit just about where we are now and how do we take stock of the last 15 or so years since the African Union has been set up. And then secondly, I want to look at what I think are some of the major challenges that have faced, on the one hand, the African Union and its attempts to build a new peace and security architecture in Africa with the ability to deploy peace operations, and then also look, secondly, at what are the major challenges that the United Nations has faced in its attempts to deploy effective peace operations. And then third and finally, I'll try and pinpoint what I think have been the major lessons that we should learn from the last 15 or 20 years or so of peacekeeping on the continent, and what are some of the recommendations for ways forward. So that's the plan. I hope I can keep you awake after lunch. I saw your lunch, it was large, so I was jealous. The context, if we're going to talk about challenges and solutions to peace operations, we need to start with where we are now in terms of the context. And I want to say a quick few points here. Number one, we've got to remember, as again you'll know better than I do, judging or evaluating the African peace and security architecture before it's even finished raises a lot of important questions. So I think that's first point we should remember. The institutions we think are necessary to do these things are not yet built. That being said, though, we've seen more peace operations than anywhere else in the world deployed in Africa. By my count, there's been about 50 since the year 2000 on the African continent. We've currently got about a dozen missions deployed across Africa at the moment. We're also seeing at the moment record numbers of peacekeepers. And I mean that in two senses, both record numbers of United Nations Blue Helmets. We've got about 80,000 of those now in Africa, more than half of which are African personnel. And then if you combine UN and African-led missions, we're now looking at over 100,000 uniformed peacekeepers on the continent, which is a record for all times. Third point of context I want to highlight is what I call partnership peacekeeping. And I think it's important to emphasize here, as I'll mention later on, there's really no such thing, I think, as purely African solutions to a lot of the continent's peace and security challenges. Rather than purely African solutions, what we've got is really a hybrid mixture of international and transnational and sometimes even globalized solutions to these problems. And so partnership peacekeeping is no exception. It stems from the fact that no single organization is able to or wants to deal with all of the peace and security challenges on the continent. So we have to get our partnerships right and if we want our peace operations to work. And then the next point of context I want to draw or recall, if you like, is that over the last 5 years, pretty much every single indicator of organized violence on the African continent has got worse. After a long period of things getting better, if you look at the peak of violence in the early 1990s across the continent, pretty much it was a story of declining levels of armed conflict until really the late 2000s. And since 2010, we've seen big increases in conflict dynamics on the continent. I would just highlight 2 or 3 particularly important trends. One, big increases in violence against civilians, i.e. the deliberate targeting and massacre of civilian populations. Secondly, a huge increase in the use of sort of asymmetric tactics and in particular improvised explosive devices as a means of warfare, along with suicide bombing and other types of things on the continent. And thirdly, a group of organizations who claim to go to war in the name of some sort of warped version of Islam, particularly Al-Shabaab, Boko Haram, AQIM and others. I think those are 3 really important contexts, which means in the last 5 years, we've seen massive increases in the trends of violence. And then the final point of context to mention is that I think the African Union remains politically divided on some of the key issues that confront the continent. As I'll talk about in a minute or so, Should we invest in the African Standby Force or the ACIRC, the Immediate Capacity for Crisis Response? Who should lead on a particular issue, the African Union or the REC concerned? What is the fundamental importance of democratic governance structures when it comes to addressing peace and security challenges? Here, I think there's still some very big divisions within the African Union, and that, I think, affects the contents moving forward. So what I want to do next is not obviously to talk about the APSA in any great level of detail. You all know this already, but I do want to highlight a couple of points. And it goes back to what I said about the African peace and security architecture, to my mind, is just not solely an African solution to African problems. I think the peace and security challenges facing the African continent are not solely African. And I think the solutions are definitely not solely African, at least as we look at them here. And the second point I want to make about this architecture is to say that obviously all the institutions, the Peace and Security Council, the Early Warning System, the Standby Force, the Panel of the Wise, the Peace Fund, all the rest of it, at one level they're meant to function autonomously and on their own. But in practical reality, for the last 15 years, and I think for the foreseeable future, they need a lot of help from their friends and their partners. So when I talk about the APSA, what I really mean is those institutions, but also the African Union Commission to support the workings of these things. I also mean the regional economic communities and the two regional mechanisms in North Africa and East Africa that were set up as part of the Standby Force. I also mean obviously the African member states themselves, because it's still only the member states that have things like soldiers, police officers, civilian experts, so we can't do anything without the states. They're all in green to symbolize, obviously, Africa, and then it starts getting even more complicated. That for the APSA to function, we actually need a whole lot of support and coordination and often capacity building from the UN, the Security Council, the different agencies and partners. We also need support from the European Union, primarily, I would say, in the form of money, but not always in the form of money. The EU is obviously also deploying its own types of missions, training and otherwise. And then we've got a whole range of bilateral partners. Obviously, Washington is one, Paris another, London are others. Now, this is just by way of saying when I'm going to talk about the African peace and security architecture from now on, I mean that entire bundle of cogs, really, because I think it's sort of arbitrary and illusory to focus on just the top left corner, because those institutions on their own at the moment are not able to deliver the results we want to see on the ground. So when I talk about the APSA, I mean this whole large swathe of institutions. And as you can imagine, that brings a huge amount of problems. There are so many moving parts when we want to deliver and design effective peace operations for the continent. It raises big questions of coordination, big questions of political authority and leadership, and really who is in charge in responding to a particular crisis on the continent. Now, that being said, though, I do want to emphasize that I think, although the APSA is not finished, and although the APSA has many different moving parts, and we've seen a lot of challenges and problems, if you compare the African Union's time with the old days of the Organization of African Unity, you see a huge increase in the ambition, in the scope, in the tempo of peace operations, to the extent now, as I put up here, African-led missions that we've seen authorized by the African Union have now deployed over 64,000 peacekeepers. I think it's important to remember that I think that would be unimaginable even 20 years ago. The OAU would never have attempted anything like this, let alone could it have fielded these types of missions. So it's important, given that what I'm going to say next is quite a lot of challenges and criticism about the architecture, it is important to remember that we are managing to deploy into the field. And whether they're effective or not, that we can judge later on. But we are deploying many, many more peacekeepers than we were before. And I think generally that's an important positive point. So as I mentioned before, I want to next dwell on what I think are the important challenges that are facing both the African peace and security architecture and then the UN's peacekeeping operations. And here I think you could develop very long lists, actually, of challenges for both the African structures and the UN missions. But I want to pinpoint what I think are the 8 most important, to my mind, for the APSA. First, as I've mentioned, is if you've got a lot of moving parts, a lot of different institutions, a lot of different donor organizations, it's going to be a real headache to have a thing called strategic coordination. And the problem here is that while everyone in theory agrees that coordination is a good thing, nobody really likes to be coordinated in practice if it means changing your way of doing things and changing your priorities and your methods and your approaches. So coordination in theory sounds good. Coordination in practice is often very difficult because it means uncomfortable changes sometimes. Now, I think in the APSA's case in particular, yes, there is questions of coordination between the African Union and the United Nations or the EU, but the main point of contention, I think, is relations within the African Union, between the African Union and the different regional economic communities. And I think if we're honest with ourselves and we look at most of the recent challenges in Africa, whether it's Mali and we have arguments between ECOWAS and the AU, or whether it's the Central African Republic and we have arguments between ECAS and the AU, whichever the case may be, sorting out the relationship between the African Union and the RECs, who gets to call the shots, who gets to lead on which particular issues, I think is an important and ongoing challenge. Thirdly, I think there needs to be greater clarity between the African governance agenda, if you like, and attempts to reform the continent politically and in terms of governance mechanisms and the peace and security architecture. And I think we've seen this increasingly now because more and more of the security crises that I think we're going to deal with on the continent will really revolve around governance issues. And that may be about electoral-related violence in Côte d'Ivoire, in Zimbabwe, wherever the latest cases may be. But I think it really is going to be increasingly a problem where we see the countries in Africa that are more authoritarian and are less well governed. I think they are going to be the sources of more and more of the security challenges facing the continent. So we need to have, I think, greater clarity on how institutions like NEPAD, the African Peer Review Mechanism, the African Charter on Elections and Governance and Democracy, how do these political instruments fit with our peace and security agenda? Fourthly then, and moving on specifically to peace operations, I think a huge challenge facing the African Union is still, after 12 or 13 years, the AU is still not able to plan its own operations, deploy its own operations, sustain its own operations in the field, and even withdraw its own operations. So until the AU can sustain its missions, we're going to have this increasingly, I think, awkward number of partners and other moving parts involved. And fifth and related, obviously, I think a key reason why the African Union can't sustain its own peace operations is money. And the key reason here is obviously we need to find, I think, a better balance between external funding for our peace operations on the continent and indigenous sources of funding. And again, you will probably know better than me, we've seen the President Obasanjo's commission looking at ways of taxing hotel visits or flights to the continent. We've seen arguments put out there about taxing text messages. I even saw recently in a latest assessment we should create an African lottery system, a lotto, and we would donate the funds raised by the lottery system to the African Union's Peace Fund. All of this, though, really emphasizes the point that at the moment, at least, African governments and African states are not funding their own mechanisms. And you can't own and you can't lead institutions that you don't pay for. And so I think one of the big challenges is finding more sources of indigenous finance. A sixth problem I see is about leadership issues. And here I'm really focused on presidential level and heads of state level rather than leadership in your sense, I think. And what I mean here is even if we built all the instruments in the African peace and security architecture, even if we had the full toolbox of an African standby force, an early warning system that worked, even if we had all of these things, we need Africa's leaders to use them. And I think, take the example of East Africa, where we've seen the East African Standby Force declare its operational capability in December of 2014. But if we look at the countries in the region, how do they respond to their security challenges? Ethiopia has a problem in Somalia. It intervenes unilaterally in Somalia. Kenya has a problem in southwest Somalia. It intervenes unilaterally. Uganda has a problem in South Sudan. It intervenes unilaterally. So until we can get our political leaders on the continent to use these multilateral mechanisms, it's going to be difficult to actually create effective missions with them. That leads then to a penultimate question about the very framework of the African Standby Force. It's designed around, as you know, scenarios that were generated in 2003, but increasingly the circumstances and the security challenges we face in 2015 are not the same. So the ASF scenarios, for example, mention nothing about natural disasters. They mention nothing about responding to environmental security challenges. They mention nothing about counterterrorism. They mention nothing about maritime security. So we've got a sense in which I think we need to update what exactly we're going to be using the African standby forces for, which leads to the final problem, I think, there, which is the very more technical issue, I think, of which of these mechanisms, the African Standby Force or the ACERC, are we really going to focus on as our primary mechanism of response? And it's not just the African architecture that I think has big challenges. I think if you look at UN peacekeeping on the continent, you also see a range of problems and issues. For the UN, I would say the first one is that the current international division of labour is not fair and it's not sustainable. If you look at the countries that authorise UN peacekeeping mandates, they're the Security Council in general and the P5 or even the P3 in particular. Yet the countries that pay for peace operations are a different group, and then the countries that actually deploy most of the personnel are a different group again. And that division of labour, I think, is not just unjust, I think it's unfair and has led to problems and tensions. Secondly, I think if you look around the African continent at the UN missions deployed there at the moment, particularly in places like Darfur, in Abyei, in Eastern Congo, in northern Mali, in Central African Republic, all of them are struggling to deal with the underlying drivers of the conflict that they're there to deal with. And the real problem here is that peacekeeping operations themselves are not a strategy for conflict resolution. Peacekeeping missions are just sort of a band-aid or a plaster, as I would call it, to put on a wound, but it can't necessarily make the patient healthy on its own. So peace operations are struggling to deal with the underlying causes of violence, particularly when it comes to host state regimes, which they have, I think, very little leverage over. Third problem the UN has is with its very philosophy of peacekeeping. The UN has built up a philosophy of peacekeeping over 70 years. It's deployed now over 70 different missions. And it says very clearly that peacekeeping works when you deploy peacekeepers when there's a peace to keep. So you deploy them after a ceasefire while you're trying to get a political settlement, or you deploy them after a political agreement to help the transition and implementation process. What UN Blue Helmets have learned very clearly over the years is that if you deploy peacekeepers into ongoing war zones, you have problems. So where there's no peace to keep, what do we do? And I think in Africa, more than anywhere else in the world, we've seen this problem come into very sharp focus. We've started to give our peacekeeping missions mandates that aren't really peacekeeping. We've given them mandates that look a bit like counterinsurgency. We've given them mandates that look a little bit like atrocity prevention. We've given them state-building mandates. Sometimes in Mali, we've got even close to giving them counter-terrorism mandates. And we've become confused, I think. Each of these tasks are important, but they require very different capabilities. They require very different skills, training, equipment, and they can't just all be, I think, thrown under the same umbrella of peacekeeping and expect good results. Fourth, I think the UN has had huge problems like the African Union with what I will call capability gaps, operational capability gaps. UN missions like African-led missions, they lack helicopters, particularly military, attack and utility ones. They lack, I would say, good ratios of armoured personnel carriers per infantry battalion. They lack intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance capabilities. They lack good medical support. You know, every battalion should have, I would say, at least a level 2 hospital attached. Many of them don't. They lack engineering capabilities. The list could go on. Penultimately, how to support missions that are missions that are authorized by the UN Security Council but are led by African organizations. Partnership peacekeeping, as I said, is going to be the key way forward. So we really have to figure out how to do this better. And as I'll talk about in a minute, we've obviously only done it once, and that's with the UN Support Office for AMISOM in Somalia, is the one time that we've allowed the African-led mission to access the funding of the UN peacekeeping assessed budget. We're going to have to think more carefully, is UNSOA the right type of mechanism? should we replicate UNSOA in different parts of the African continent? So far, the UN has said, no, we're not going to do this in Mali. No, we're not going to do this in Central African Republic. But what about the next missions? How does this model look? And then finally, I think a huge challenge for the UN increasingly is how to maintain impartiality if your peace operations are going to deploy into areas where you face spoiler groups like Al-Shabaab, Boko Haram, AQIM and others. It's going to be very difficult, I think, for the UN's traditional version or philosophy of peacekeeping to meet these sort of current conflict realities on the continent. And as we could talk about later, the Force Intervention Brigade in MONUSCO in Eastern Congo, I think, is obviously at the sharp end of that debate. So where does this leave us? And the last points I want to make are to do with what lessons we may have learned over the last 15 years and what I think we can do moving forward. And I'll skip through these pretty quickly. I put learned question mark. I don't think most of our political leaders have really learned these lessons. That's why I put that in brackets. I think it would be a good idea, though, if they did. Firstly, we have to make partnerships work better. And the key partnerships on the African continent, I think, are between the sort of multilateral institutions, the AU, the UN, and the REX, but increasingly with the European Union involved as well. And then bilateral partnerships. As you can tell from my accent, I'm British, really, but I do have an American passport. But it pains me to say, really, that Britain is not the key player these days. It's the United States and France, in terms of external countries, that are the most important, I think, in thinking about peacekeeping operations. Secondly, though, peacekeeping operations are not the same thing as a strategy for conflict resolution. Peace operations are instruments, they're not strategies. What we really need to do is find a political settlement to end the war in Darfur, in Eastern Congo, in northern Mali. Peacekeepers can't do that. So if we keep throwing peacekeeping operations at crisis zones and pretending they're the same thing as peacemaking, diplomacy, and conflict resolution, we'll find ourselves there for decades. Fourth, though, if we're going to be there for decades, and I think obviously this is quite likely in some parts of the continent, it's only the UN that can conduct and sustain big peace operations. Until the African Union and the REC sort out their indigenous financial issues, nobody else can do this. That means, fifthly, we're going to have to think, I think, much more carefully about transitions in our operations, particularly the transitions from African-led missions to UN Blue Helmet operations. Sixth, the troop contributing countries. I think it does matter quite a lot, actually, who's keeping the peace in a particular conflict zone. It does matter where troop contributing countries come from. And I think if we look at the difference here between UN missions and African Union missions, the results are quite instructive, I think. Although the UN is using many more African peacekeepers than it used to, it still draws a lot on South Asians, India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, and also some South American and other countries, Uruguayans, Brazilians, and others. But if you look at most African-led missions, the troop contributing countries are coming from the neighborhood, the immediate neighbors, in fact. And this has pros and cons, I think. If you look at AMISOM in Somalia, for example, there's some good reasons why it's good to have Djibouti and Kenya and Ethiopia as key troop contributing countries. But politically, there's also some very important reasons why it's not probably the best thing to have Ethiopians and Kenyans running a lot of south-central Somalia. Seventh, I think the big conclusion to draw over the last 15 years is peacekeeping can't be done by the military alone. We have to get serious about multidimensionality. And that means having better experience and better expertise from police forces and civilians in our missions. And finally, the big lesson, I think, for me at least, is that of all the tasks that peacekeeping operations are mandated to fulfill, I think the most important in every theatre is about protection of civilians. If we don't get this right, I think no mission will be able to succeed. Even if you take an example like AMISOM, where the mission doesn't actually have a mandate officially to protect civilians. It has a mandate to degrade Al-Shabaab and protect the federal government now. Even where a mission is not given a civilian protection mandate, the locals do not judge AMISOM solely on how many Al-Shabaab fighters they kill. They judge them on whether AMISOM can bring a peace dividend to the recovered areas, whether they can protect the civilians from Shabaab attacks. So I think even in cases where we don't mandate civilian protection, it's important as a task. And then finally, about 6 months ago, I gave a talk on similar lines here on a similar subject, and I didn't include this last slide, and I stopped. And I got a lot of criticisms from the audience that this guy just puts out loads of challenges and has no solutions for anything. So in my defense, I'm an academic, so I don't have any solutions for any of these things. My job is to raise annoying questions and challenge you to come up with solutions. But what I've said, if partnership peacekeeping is going to be actually really the way forward, we can't just have solutions coming out of Africa alone. Africa's challenges, I think, are too important for that. I think there needs to be the best that we can do in a hybrid international sense. So in that spirit, because otherwise I'll get told off, I at least offer a few recommendations of what we can do better. The first one, we've got to make those partnerships work better. And what I think is important here is really about information and analysis. If we want to have shared objectives, which we're going to need to have shared solutions, we really need to have the same analysis of the problems that we face. And I think a big problem that we've seen, and why the UN and the AU and others sometimes disagree, is that we don't share the same analysis of the problem, or we put different problems in different levels of priority. So I think it's very important that we try and share as much information and analysis as possible so that we can come up with the same diagnosis of the problems, the same priorities of the issues, and hence then give ourselves a chance of coming up with shared solutions. Secondly, you're going to hear, and obviously we have heard in the last few years, a lot of talk about exit strategies. How can MONUSCO leave DR Congo? How can AMISOM leave Somalia? I think there's big challenges for exit strategies because we don't think hard enough about the entry strategies. And I think what we need to do better going forward is think really honestly with ourselves, what are the situations where peace operations can help, and what are the situations where they can't? In a situation like Darfur, for example, where you have an ongoing war, none of the parties are really serious about peace. I would say roughly the same thing about South Sudan in the last couple of years. What can peacekeepers do? Of course, they can help facilitate humanitarian assistance. They can put a lid on the very worst negative consequences of warfare. But they can't solve a war when the belligerents want to fight a war. And so I think we need to think very carefully about what are the circumstances where it's just wrong, the wrong choice of instrument to deploy a peacekeeping mission. Third, about the money, we have to solve the funding problem for African missions. There can be no ownership, I think, and no leadership of the peace and security architecture in Africa unless there's more of a slice of the funds come from the African continent. I think the place to start there is with the Obasanjo report, but also to persuade governments or heads of state on the continent that these are problems that are worth investing in. We all know the sort of truisms and the cliches, but investing in this stuff is quite expensive, but it's going to be more expensive and more costly if we don't invest in these peace mechanisms and we have to resort to war and other things later on. We could do much better at ensuring smoother transitions between African-led and UN missions, and we can do that quite easily, making sure the mandates are basically the same. A big problem in the Mali case was that APSA had a very different set of mandated tasks to the UN mission. We need to make sure that standards and capabilities are the same across the African Union and the UN. It's no use having African Union and African-led peacekeeping operations basically operating on a lower threshold of standards for equipment and other things, and then expecting them to immediately raise those thresholds when they transition to blue helmet operations. Fifth, I think we've got to focus more and more on civilian protection. And I mean by that both the philosophy, if you like, the doctrine behind it. What are the military and policing tasks involved in civilian protection? How do we identify those, and then how do we train for those? It's not the same as defeating an enemy, so how do we do it? Political resolve. We need the political will to protect civilians. Sometimes we may even have to use deadly force to do that. Penultimately, multidimensionality. As I've said before, peace operations can't be done purely by the military. In fact, I think more successful peace operations really will be demilitarized. That means, though, we have to work together, think together, and train together as police, soldiers, and civilians. We have to build our pre-deployment training and other regimes around the idea of multidimensionality. And then finally, I think we have to better engage local communities. I think if peacekeepers are seen as abusing the local population, either through sexual exploitation and abuse or corruption and ill discipline, trading in charcoal in Somalia, trading in gold in Eastern Congo, whatever the case, if peacekeepers are seen as abusers rather than ambassadors for the local population, no peace operation is going to succeed. So I think we need to find better ways of engaging with local communities. And I'll stop there for a discussion and any questions.